Something just happened that nobody in Washington saw coming. Canada, one of America's closest allies, a neighbor, a partner in NORAD, a country that shares the longest undefended border in the world with the United States, is now seriously reconsidering its commitment to the F-35 fighter jet program. And they are not just quietly reviewing internal documents. They are actively engaging with Sweden about an alternative. That's right. Canada is now in advanced discussions to potentially replace its F-35 commitment with the Saab Gripen. And if you think this is just a story about airplanes, you are missing the bigger picture entirely. This potential decision could send shockwaves through NATO alliances, through the American defense industry, through the geopolitical balance of power in North America, and through decades of military cooperation that most people assumed would never be questioned. So let's break this down, because there is a lot more happening beneath the surface than the headlines are telling you. To understand why this is such a massive deal, you first have to understand what the F-35 program actually represents. This is not just a fighter jet. The F-35 Joint Strike Fighter is the most expensive weapons program in the history of human civilization. We are talking about a program that has cost the United States and its partner nations well over $1.5 trillion in development, production, and projected life cycle costs. It is the crown jewel of American defense manufacturing. It is Lockheed Martin's most important product. It is the aircraft that the Pentagon has bet its entire future air combat strategy on. And Canada was supposed to be a core partner in all of this. Canada was actually one of the original partner nations in the F-35 program. Canadian companies received contracts. Canadian defense officials were briefed at the highest levels. In fact, Canada had already committed to purchasing 88 F-35 jets in a deal worth approximately $19 billion. Some deliveries were scheduled to begin as early as 2026. Canadian pilots were being trained. The infrastructure was being prepared. The whole thing was essentially moving forward until political winds began to shift. The Canadian government has been facing mounting pressure on multiple fronts. There are concerns about cost overruns. There are concerns about delivery timelines that keep slipping. There are political debates about sovereignty and about whether Canada should be so deeply tied to American defense systems at a time when the relationship between Ottawa and Washington has become increasingly complicated. And now, credible reports indicate that senior Canadian officials are actively exploring whether a contract cancellation or significant modification might be politically and economically viable. Sweden's Gripen has emerged as the primary alternative under consideration. A fighter jet built by Saab, yes, the same country known for its cars, though the defense division operates on an entirely different level. The Gripen is a capable, proven, fourth-generation multi-role fighter. It is smaller than the F-35. It is cheaper to operate. It is faster to maintain. And critically, it comes with something the F-35 does not offer in the same way: technology transfer agreements that give Canada far more control over its own military hardware. That last point is more important than most people realize. When a country buys the F-35, they are not just buying an aircraft. They are buying into an entire American-controlled ecosystem. The software updates, the maintenance data, the mission systems, all of it runs through American infrastructure. Canada would be flying jets that, in many operational respects, Washington has a key to. With the Gripen, Canada would get a much greater degree of independence. They could maintain the aircraft on their own terms. They could potentially modify systems based on their own national requirements. That is a form of sovereignty that cannot be understated. Now, some people in the defense community will immediately push back and say the Gripen simply cannot match the F-35 in terms of stealth capability, sensor fusion, or fifth-generation technology. And that is technically accurate. The F-35 is a stealth aircraft. The Gripen is not. In a high-end, peer-level conflict involving sophisticated air defenses, the F-35 has real advantages that the Gripen cannot replicate. Nobody is seriously disputing that. But here's the question some Canadian policymakers are now asking. What threats does Canada realistically face? Canada is not planning to conduct deep strike missions into heavily defended enemy territory. Canada needs aircraft to patrol its vast Arctic airspace. Canada needs aircraft to fulfill its NATO commitments, to intercept and identify unknown aircraft, to conduct maritime patrol operations, to support ground troops if necessary. And for the majority of those missions, a capable fourth-generation aircraft like the Gripen could do the job effectively and at a fraction of the long-term operational cost. The numbers around F-35 operational costs have been a constant source of frustration for everyone involved in the program. The cost per flight hour for the F-35 has been notoriously high. Critics within the Pentagon itself have raised alarms about the sustainability of operating large fleets of these aircraft over the coming decades. Maintenance requirements are intensive. The support infrastructure is enormous. For a country like Canada, which operates a relatively modest air force and faces genuine budget pressures, the long-term cost argument for reconsidering the Gripen is genuinely compelling. But let's be honest about something. This potential policy reversal is not purely about dollars and cents. There is a political dimension here that is impossible to ignore, and it connects directly to the state of the relationship between Canada and the United States right now. The past several years have seen a noticeable shift in how Canadians think about their relationship with America. Tariff disputes have created real economic pain for Canadian industries. Political rhetoric coming out of Washington, including comments that many Canadians found deeply offensive and even threatening regarding Canadian sovereignty, has stirred something in the national consciousness north of the border. There is a growing sentiment in Canada that the country needs to diversify its partnerships, reduce its dependencies, and assert itself more independently on the world stage. Reconsidering the Gripen over the F-35 fits neatly into that narrative. It would say to Washington, "We value our alliance, but we are not your client state. We make decisions based on our national interests, and right now, our national interests may point towards Stockholm rather than Fort Worth." The implications for Lockheed Martin would be devastating if this reconsideration becomes a full contract cancellation. Canada's order represents billions of dollars in revenue and adds a major allied nation to the F-35's customer list. Losing Canada, especially losing Canada to a European competitor, would be a reputational blow as much as a financial one. It would give other nations who may be having second thoughts about F-35 procurement a very visible example to point to. If Canada can walk away, others might start asking whether they should reconsider too. And think about the potential geopolitical ripple effects beyond just the defense industry. Sweden is a relatively new NATO member. Sweden joining NATO was itself a historic development. A country that had maintained military non-alignment for over 200 years, finally deciding that the security environment demanded full alliance membership. For Sweden to potentially land a major fighter jet contract with Canada, another NATO ally, would be a powerful statement about Sweden's rising strategic importance within the alliance. It would signal that Sweden is not just a passive member of NATO, but an active contributor with world-class defense technology that other members find genuinely attractive. For the broader NATO alliance, the optics would be complicated. NATO has consistently pushed for interoperability, the idea that allied nations should use compatible equipment that allows their militaries to work together seamlessly. The F-35 is increasingly becoming the standard fighter platform for many NATO members. If Canada were to operate Gripens while flying alongside American, British, Norwegian, Danish, and Dutch F-35s, there would be real questions about how seamlessly those forces could integrate in a real conflict scenario. These would not be insurmountable problems. NATO has always operated with diverse equipment across its members, but they would add complexity. There is also the question of what this would mean for NORAD, the joint Canadian-American command that has been responsible for aerospace defense of North America since the Cold War era. NORAD modernization has been a major priority, with both countries committing to significant investments in new radar systems, new satellites, and, yes, new aircraft. The assumption has always been that Canada and the United States would be operating broadly similar aircraft within NORAD's framework. A Canadian fleet of Gripens would introduce new variables into that equation. American officials and defense analysts are already expressing concern about these developments. Expect significant pressure from Washington on Ottawa in the coming weeks and months if this reconsideration gains momentum. Expect arguments about interoperability. Expect arguments about alliance cohesion. Expect arguments about the importance of flying the same platforms as your closest ally. Whether those arguments move Canada at this point remains to be seen, because here is what the Canadians would likely say in response. They would point out that the Gripen is a NATO-qualified aircraft. They would point out that Canadian pilots have trained alongside dozens of different aircraft types throughout the alliance's history and managed just fine. They would point out that Sweden itself is now a NATO ally, meaning the Gripen is quite literally a NATO aircraft. And they would point out that sovereignty means making your own decisions, even when your closest ally disagrees. The other dimension of this story that deserves serious attention is the industrial and economic side. If Canada were to buy the Gripen, Swedish companies would get the work. Swedish engineers would build the aircraft. Swedish workers would benefit. And under the technology transfer arrangements that would come with such a deal, Canadian companies would also participate in production and maintenance work, keeping economic benefits within Canada's own industrial base. That would matter to Canadian politicians trying to justify this decision to their constituents. They could say that this deal creates Canadian jobs, develops Canadian aerospace capabilities, and reduces long-term dependence on a foreign-controlled support ecosystem. With the F-35, the industrial benefits for Canada are real, but still filtered through Lockheed Martin's enormous prime contractor structure. A Gripen deal could potentially give Canada a more direct and substantial industrial stake in its own Air Force's future. Now, is a contract cancellation likely? In the world of major defense procurement, these decisions move slowly. Political winds shift. New governments come to power with different priorities. There are people within Canada's defense establishment who genuinely believe that the F-35 is the superior aircraft and that walking away would be a strategic mistake. Those voices are loud and influential. There are also significant contractual and financial penalties associated with canceling a deal this far into the process. Canada would face substantial exit costs. Lockheed Martin and the U.S. government would almost certainly push back aggressively through every diplomatic and legal channel available. The political fallout could be severe. There is also the technical question of whether the Gripen's capabilities would remain adequate through the full life cycle of any potential contract, which could extend into the 2050s and beyond. The threat environment is changing rapidly. Advances in air defense systems, in electronic warfare, in hypersonic weapons, all of these evolve the case for stealth in ways that are difficult to predict decades in advance. Critics will argue that Canada would essentially be buying yesterday's technology to save money today, and that future generations would pay the strategic price. Supporters of a potential switch will counter that you cannot let the perfect be the enemy of the good. They will argue that an affordable fleet of capable aircraft that Canada can actually maintain and operate sustainably is more valuable than a smaller, more expensive fleet of fifth-generation jets that strain the defense budget and create dependency on American systems. This debate is intensifying. The direction is not yet final. But the fact that Canada is seriously entertaining this reconsideration at all, after years of commitment to the F-35 program, tells you everything you need to know about the current state of Canadian-American relations. And the world is watching how Washington responds. Because the way America handles this moment matters a great deal. If the response is heavy-handed, if the pressure applied to Ottawa is perceived as bullying or coercive, it will backfire. It will reinforce exactly the impulse that is driving some in Canada toward the Gripen in the first place. The desire for independence from an increasingly transactional American relationship. It could push Canada further toward European partnerships, toward deeper engagement with the European Union's developing defense structures, toward a broader realignment that serves no one's long-term interests on either side of the border. If the response is measured, if American officials acknowledge Canada's sovereign right to evaluate its own procurement decisions while working to address cost and interoperability concerns pragmatically, there is a path to maintaining the core strength of the Canada-U.S. defense relationship, regardless of which aircraft Canada ultimately flies. The F-35 program will survive even if Canada walks away. It has too many other customers, too much momentum, too deep an integration into American and allied defense planning to be derailed by one nation's contract decision. But the symbolism here runs deep. Canada was a founding partner. Canada was supposed to be in the tent from the very beginning. And Canada is now publicly entertaining the possibility of building a different tent entirely. That says something about where we are in the current geopolitical moment. Alliances that seemed unshakable are showing their fault lines. Economic relationships that seemed permanent are being renegotiated. Defense partnerships that seemed written in stone are being reconsidered in light of shifting political realities and evolving national interests. Canada seriously considering Sweden's Gripen over America's F-35 is one data point in a much larger story. A story about the fragmentation of the post-Cold War Western alliance structure, about the rise of middle power independence, about the complex interplay between economics, politics, and national security in an increasingly uncertain world. This is not just a story about fighter jets. It is a story about who gets to make the rules, who gets to control the technology, and who gets to decide what independence actually means in the 21st century. And Canada may soon give us a very clear answer to all three of those questions. Stay with us, because this story is far from over.